It was the most successful military operation of the decade, and it was a complete catastrophe. On the morning of November 6, 1956, British paratroopers stood on the banks of the Suez Canal. They had executed a flawless tactical insertion, routed the Egyptian army, and seized the critical waterway that pumped oil into the heart of Europe. Militarily, they were the victors. The Union Jack flew over Port Said, and the soldiers believed they were restoring the natural order of the world. 48 hours later, they were ordered to retreat. There was no counterattack. No Soviet bombers appeared on the horizon. The British Empire was not defeated by a better army, a brilliant general, or a new superweapon. It was defeated by a phone call. The call came from Washington to London, and the message was brutal. The United States was not sending troops to help. Instead, they were threatening to sell their holdings of the British pound. In the hallways of the British Treasury, the blood drained from every face. The military victory on the ground had triggered a financial nuclear detonation in the markets. The empire had run out of cash, and the landlord was calling in the debt. To understand how a global superpower can vanish over a single weekend, you have to look past the maps and the medals. You have to look at the ledger. In 1956, Britain learned the hardest lesson of the modern age. You cannot be a superpower if your currency is on a leash held by someone else. Before the humiliation, there was the illusion. In the mid-1950s, Britain was suffering from a collective hallucination. They looked at the world map and saw a sea of pink, representing the vast swaths of Africa and Asia they still controlled. To the average citizen, Britain was still one of the big three, sitting at the high table with the United States and the Soviet Union. But this was a facade. World War II had hollowed the country out. Britain had sold off foreign investments, liquidated gold reserves, and taken on massive loans from the U.S. just to keep the lights on. The economy was like a stately manor house mortgaged to the hilt. It looked impressive from the street, but the furniture was being repossessed. At the helm of this fragile ship was Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Eden was a man obsessed with his legacy, having spent years in the shadow of Winston Churchill. He was handsome, diplomatic, and deeply insecure. By 1956, he was also physically ill, relying on a cocktail of amphetamines and sedatives to manage pain from a botched surgery. When Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956, Aden didn't see a geopolitical dispute. He saw a ghost. He looked at Nasser and saw Mussolini. Eden became convinced that if he didn't crush Nasser immediately, Britain would look weak. He viewed the canal not just as an economic asset, but as the jugular vein of the empire. So he decided to take it back. But he made a fatal mistake. He assumed that because Britain was a great power, the United States would simply fall in line. He didn't ask for permission. In fact, he deliberately hid his plans from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eden, conspiring with France and Israel, hatched a secret invasion plan that belonged in the 19th century, completely ignoring the financial reality of the 20th. This brings us to the mechanism of the collapse, the sterling balances and the run on the bank. In the 1950s, the British pound was still a reserve currency. Many countries held their national savings in pounds kept in London. This system allowed Britain to punch above its weight. Even though Britain was technically broke, it held the bank accounts for half the world. As long as everyone remained calm, the system worked. But this relied entirely on confidence. It is the same dynamic as a local bank. If you deposit money, the bank lends it out. If everyone comes back for their money on the same day, the bank collapses because they don't have the cash in the vault. Britain's cash in the vault, its gold and dollar reserves, were dangerously low. They had enough for trading, but not enough for a panic. If the world decided the pound was risky, they would sell pounds to buy US dollars. The Bank of England would have to use its precious dollar reserves to buy back the pounds to keep the price stable. If they ran out of dollars, the currency would collapse. A collapsed currency means you can't import food or oil. For an island nation like Britain, it means instant catastrophic poverty. This was the lever the United States was holding. When the invasion began, the deception was revealed. Israel invaded across the Sinai, and Britain and France landed troops to protect the canal. It was transparent, clumsy, and it infuriated Eisenhower. The U.S. president felt personally betrayed by his allies launching a war just days before his re-election. Eisenhower didn't send the Marines. He simply told his Treasury Secretary to pull the plug. The markets reacted first. As news of the war spread, global holders of the pound panicked. They started selling. The Bank of England began burning through its dollar reserves to prop up the currency, losing millions an hour. It was a financial hemorrhage. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, looked at the numbers and froze. He realized the Bank of England couldn't sustain the defense for more than a few days. They needed an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Technically, Britain had the right to withdraw these funds, but the United States held the veto power. When Britain applied for the loan, the U.S. representative was under strict orders. No ceasefire, no money. Then came the kill shot. Eisenhower quietly let it be known that the US Treasury intended to sell part of its own holdings of British bonds. This is the equivalent of a billionaire announcing he's dumping all his stock in a specific company. It guarantees a crash. If the US sold its reserves, it would trigger a global stampede. The timeline was terrifyingly fast. The invasion force landed on November 6th. By November 7th, Macmillan was on the phone to Washington, begging. He was told bluntly that unless Britain committed to a total withdrawal by midnight, the U.S. would block the IMF fade and sell the sterling bonds. Macmillan walked into the cabinet meeting in London. The generals were celebrating. They had the canal. They had won the war. Macmillan had to look them in the eye and tell them that while they had won the battle, the country was about to die. He explained that without U.S. support, the British pound would collapse within 48 hours. The country would be bankrupt. There would be no money to pay for the oil coming through the canal they had just seized. It was checkmate. Prime Minister Eden was broken. The stress, combined with his failing health, destroyed his resolve. He capitulated. He called the French, who were furious, and ordered the ceasefire. The troops, confused and angry, stopped their advance just miles short of total control. The aftermath was the definitive end of an era. Britain had tried to assert itself as an independent superpower and had been slapped down like a misbehaving child. Eden resigned shortly after, his reputation in tatters. But the real shift was in the plumbing of the global economy. Before Suez, the British pound was still seen as a rival to the US dollar. After Suez, the illusion was gone. The world saw that the pound was only valuable if the United States allowed it to be. The dollar became the undisputed hegemon of global finance. We also saw the birth of modern financial warfare. Eisenhower demonstrated that you don't need to bomb a country to defeat it. If you control the reserve currency and the lines of credit, you can bring a nation to its knees without firing a shot. We see the echoes of this strategy today. When the U.S. cuts a nation off from the banking system or freezes assets, they are using the weapon that was battle-tested in 1956. The Suez Crisis proved that in the modern world, sovereignty is economic. A nation that cannot feed itself or fuel its industry without foreign credit is not truly independent. Britain had forgotten that its military machine was running on borrowed money. We often think of empires ending in fire and ruin, with barbarians storming the gates. But the British Empire didn't end that way. It ended in a quiet room with a group of exhausted men staring at a balance sheet, realizing that the overdraft was canceled. The lesson of those 48 hours is timeless. Military strength is visible, loud, and seductive. But financial leverage is silent, invisible, and absolute. You can have the best army on earth, but if you don't control your own currency, you don't control your own destiny. History is written by the victors, but it is funded by the creditors. And the creditor always makes the rules.